Now the starting page is working. What about the event detail page here? This page currently still fetches its data from the dummy data file. It's this event ID, this dynamic page here. And of course here we now also want to get our concrete event, the individual event for which we want to display data, we want to get that from our Firebase backend. Now for this, first of all, we can go to dummy data and copy the getEventById function and add this to the API util.js file. Export it there, but turn it into an async function. And instead of dummy events here, we again want to use all events. So just as in get featured events, I'll get access to all events, await this, and then find my single event on the, overall events which I got here. Now that's step 1. Step 2 is to use that in the dynamic event ID page. And again, the question is, how do we want to fetch the data? Now we could fetch it on the client side, but that wouldn't make more sense here than it does on the home page. It's still unlikely that it changes a lot, and this page for an individual event is even more important when it comes to search engines than the starting page. After all, it's the single event page that has all the details for an event. So this should absolutely be crawlable. We definitely want to have some data on this page right from the start. So therefore here, I definitely also want to pre-render this page with data. Again, the question is static generation with getStaticProps or server-side rendering with getServerSideProps. And as often, the answer probably is getStaticProps. Because this again is not really a page where we need user-specific data, which changes all the time, or anything like that. So pre-generating it sounds good to me. So in this event ID page here, in this page file, we therefore also want to export the async getStaticProps function again. Here, however, we'll need the context because we'll need to know for which specific event ID we want to load the event data. So we can get the event ID from context, and there the params, and then their event ID, because this here is the identifier I encoded in the file name. This gives us access to the event ID. Once we have the event ID, we want to fetch the single event, and therefore I remove the import of getEventById from dummy data, and instead import getEventById from, going up one level and another level, helpers API util. So from this API util file which sends requests to Firebase. And now we want to use this in getStaticProps to get that single event. For this we await getEventById, because that's an async function returning a promise, and we still pass the event ID to that function. And then here in the end we'll get that event for which we're looking. Now once we got that, we can return our object as we always do with the props key. And then there, my props object will have an event or selected event key, totally up to you, which holds that single event which was identified here. So now inside of my component function, we can now work with that selected event prop. So we should accept props here, and then my event here, which I use throughout this component, is actually props.selectedEvent. Now in this component function, we now no longer need to use the router, the useRouter hook, because we no longer need access to the event ID in there, because data fetching doesn't happen inside of this component function anymore. So the concrete event ID doesn't matter to us here. And if it would, we could get it from this selected event prop, because that holds the entire event which we identified. So we no longer need useRouter here, and we can therefore also get rid of the import, of course. Now with that it wouldn't work though. And do you remember why? Because this is a dynamic page. And there is an infinite amount of possible pages that could be generated. Next.js doesn't know which event IDs it should pre-generate. And as a developer, we typically also don't know that in advance. If we have a dynamic page, maybe with user-generated content, then as a developer, we also can't anticipate which IDs we'll eventually have. That's why we need another function here. We need to also export another async function, the getStaticPaths function. This function will tell Next.js for which parameter values, so for which event IDs, it should pre-render this page, and for which IDs it should therefore call getStaticProps and this component function. For this, in getStaticPaths, we have to return an object with a paths key, which holds an array full of objects where we specify our param values. So the first page, which we want to generate, for example, should have a value for the event ID param of E1. That's something we could add here. And now this single page for the event with E1 as an ID would be pre-generated. But as I just said, we typically don't know all IDs in advance. So that's typically not what we want to do. Instead, we want to fetch the event IDs here dynamically as well and derive this paths array dynamically. So for this, what we can do is we can go to API util and use getAllEvents to get all events, then extract their IDs and derive the to-be-generated paths from that. So for this, I'll go back here to event ID, and from the helpers API util file, I will also import getAllEvents. And now here in getStaticPaths, I will have all my events here by awaiting getAllEvents. And then I'll construct my paths array by taking my events and mapping this array of events into an array of objects where every object has a params key, which holds another object, where I then set the event ID to event.id. Event is the single event for which we're going through that events array here. So now paths is exactly the kind of array we need, and hence I'll set paths equal to paths here. With that, if we save this all, if we reload this events page for event E2, we get an error regarding the fallback key. And you might remember that we need to add this fallback key to let Next.js know if there are more possible event ID values, which we did not pre-generate here, so which it should then maybe generate dynamically on the fly, or if we did specify all possible paths here. Now here I did specify all paths, so we can set fallback to false, letting Next.js know that if we try to load this page for an unknown ID, it should show the 404 page. And with that, if we set this and reload again, now it correctly loads the page for E2. And that works for the other event as well. Now if I try E5, which is an invalid ID, I get the 404 page instead, which also makes sense. So with that, we're also handling this dynamic page successfully here. Before we now also dive into the slug page and this index page here for all events, before we do that, let's pause for a second and think about the two pages we worked on. Index.js here on the root level of the pages folder and the dynamic event ID page. Maybe there's something we can optimize, or where we could at least consider optimizations.